Hey, what's up everybody? Rob here from Ram Studio Comics. Welcome back. So in today's video, I figured I would show you some of this work and render some of the surfaces. So this is just an X-Men piece, kind of just playing around, having some fan art fun. It to this area, and I've talked about rendering like shiny surfaces before, but I don't know that I've done it in a traditional art video. I think it was just digital. So it's the same concepts, but I figured everybody's been asking for more traditional art videos. So I'll explain it in this instance. So this shoulder piece of Wolverine's is generally pretty shiny, right? So you see I've kind of laid in a little bit of the idea right there. So that would be the gradient. As I've said before, chrome is really just anything shiny or really shiny, I guess, very specular, very reflective, is reflecting the horizon, is reflecting the area around it. So it can be the room, it could be a city, it could be the horizon, it could be any number of things. So what you have to think about is what's, where they're at always, I guess, because you're always thinking of like how to light the scene, how to color the scene, things like that. But this would be ultimately just like a, we'll say a horizon. So if you were to look off into the distance, you're going to see some kind of horizon line, whether it's a cityscape or mountains or whatever, and it's going to go from dark, it's going to fade down to light, and then you're going to get some like blue up here, and it's going to fade down like this. So this is kind of the look that you get. If you were to break this down into line art, that's why you get, you'll see this representation of a couple swirls, some shadowing, some swirls up here. These are like kind of like the clouds. And that's really the concept. It's pretty simple, but obviously you can take that and elaborate it much, much further and do, be inventive and creative and all that good stuff. So what I'm going to do is soft erase this back and try to, develop this further. So again, I'll kind of lay in that base idea of where I want the, again, horizon line or core, solid shadows or whatever. And then I'll break those apart. So at first I'll start with a couple swirling lines like this, and I'll just play around with some concepts. So I'll just kind of bounce back and forth, thick to thin. Have some kind of fading off or, breaking apart from the bulk of the shadow there. And then I'll also play around with the way that I render these. So it's not just the shading or not just the solid shadow, but the way that you render them and add your little bits of style to that concept. I guess it's all style, but so let's do this. Let's get it to about right here. I'll make it a little bit thicker, because I also think that what really makes this pop is if you have enough solid area there. So if you do these like little thin lines all over the place, it can look kind of cool, but maybe it doesn't have the weight to it that it needs to really read well. So that might be a reason that you're not getting it to look the way that you want. So sometimes thickening up those lines makes a dramatic kind of effect, or makes it look much, much better. So now what I'm going to do is get in here, and I'm going to go from thick to thin and just kind of render and crosshatch this. So again, I'm thinking of that fade that I'm trying to emulate with this type of line work. So just get those thinner. You can do a couple things. You can make it thinner. You can also make the lines go from thick to thin, and you can space them out. Or I guess that was two different things. You can make them thicker to thinner, or you can do that and space them out at the same time. And then obviously cross-hatching it adds that next level of shading. Bringing these over at about a 45. Again, I can space these out. I like to make the one series of lines thicker than the other. That's just my particular way of doing it. Obviously cross-hatching, there's all sorts of ways you could really get in there and do that and develop it. And then also I want a nice heavy line around the shoulder plate here. So I'm going to worry about using some weighted lines all the way around this. Not worry about it, think about it, I guess. So a nice heavy line there, maybe thicker where it bows into the middle, maybe thinner where it comes to a point here. Same thing here, thinner at the point, thicker where it kind of bends over. Just like that. And if I wanted a nice strong glare up here, I could also thin out that line weight right where I decide to put a glare. So if I put like this starburst type glare, I can even erase back a little bit, because generally the line gaps will coincide with the light source, right? So you could do something like that. But anyways, I don't know that I'm going to put that glare there. I'm just trying to give you some ideas. Now, somebody like Chrome Dome here, then I might do more of that. I might put like a nice glare on his shoulder. And I would probably put it up here, because I guess if I felt like if I put it here and here and here and here, I get all over the place, it's not going to have the same effect. It's going to look, it's going to take away from the effect, and it's going to look silly. So I would probably save it for Colossus there. Okay, so now back up here, we're going to want to think about where these reflections of the clouds would be, if that's in fact what they are. But really, again, it's not so much that you're trying to draw clouds in this area. I'm trying to get you to think about the idea behind the chrome reflection, so that basically so you memorize it. So when you go to do this again on your own, you just have these little bits of things to relate it to. That's how I remember all the things that I draw, relate it to other things. If not, I would probably go insane. But it's like this, kind of swirling these lines around. Again, you can really play around with this. There's no exact rhyme or reason. You can do as many or as little as you want, whatever looks good to your particular style. Another thing you can do is you can make it solid up here, and you can do like these little glares in the solid area. So you could bring this up to a solid, and you could put these tiny little ovals up here. I see that a lot in different styles. I think it looks pretty cool. Again, you could put a starburst right there instead of these ovals. So lots of ways you could think about doing that. You can also render this as well up here. Now, I feel like I can even add a little bit more rendering down here. I feel like I want the majority of the shadowing right here on the shoulder plate. So what I'm saying is, if I add it all over, it starts to change the dynamic of it a little bit. I think I could get away with a few little lines going off this way, but keep them very light. I just don't want them to conflict with this. And sometimes you can really lose the intensity of the effect because you're, putting detail everywhere. You always hear artists refer to it as, letting your eye rest. You want to have areas of detail and areas where you let the eye rest. And I'll be honest, that's not my strong suit. I tend to detail all over the place just because I love rendering. I think I get kind of caught up in the moment, but you got to be aware of that. So let your eye rest. Give your area focal points. Give it some areas where it's highly detailed, other areas where it's not. So that's essentially how I would do chrome, and I really use the same method anywhere that I apply the effect. It's just one of those things where once you kind of memorize that process of a horizon line, some clouds, where the light source would be in relationship to the material, it's really not that hard. And then it's like, okay, how do I want to create my swirl lines? And I just kind of throw those lines. I always think of like a Coca-Cola can, that little swirl that goes through the Coca-Cola can. But I just throw those lines, I swirl them around, and then I pick them apart as far as what looks cool. So play around with that concept, see if that helps. I'll do one more little bit. I'll do the part of the glove here, because this is another area where it's specular, but it's not chrome. It's just kind of a bit shiny. And actually, I guess you could look at this a couple of ways, and I'm sure the character has been drawn any number of ways, where some people probably do it where it's specular, other people probably do it where it's more of a dull finish. But essentially, what I like to do here is just make sure that it's different from the arm. So the shadows here need to be a little bit heavier, I think. So I'm going to make those a bit more weighted. This. And I might put shadows on both sides of each muscle group, for instance. So where on the arm, I'm going to leave a lot more open light source. I'm still going to put in some heavy shadows so it beefs up the anatomy there, but I need it to read a little bit differently than when it gets down here. So down here, On Wolverine's suit, it's a darker blue. And generally, when something's darker, you fill it in more. And so I'm going to use heavier shapes of shadows here. And again, I'm probably going to use them on both sides of the muscle so that essentially it gives it a high point. Like if you look at a, what could I compare it to? I guess a cylinder. You know, if you look at a cylinder and you put a shadow on one side, that gives a certain volume to the cylinder, right? If you put a shadow on the other side, it now shows that the light source is right on the front here, and that's the highest point of the cylinder. So essentially, without that secondary shadow, the light source is way up high, you know, higher, okay? And that's why you're only getting a shadow at the bottom. So probably a few other ways you can interpret that, but that's essentially what I'm going for when I do a darker material that's more specular. The light source is just reacting a bit more abruptly, or what's a good way to put it? It's just more specific in the area that it's affecting because it's darker and it's still specular enough to catch the light source. So you're seeing it in a very focused area, a very specific area of the material. So that's essentially my thought process on here. Hopefully that makes sense. It seemed a bit strange explaining that, but that's it's kind of tough to say. The main thing I think that's really important is that you just don't render all the materials the same. That regardless, that there's a little bit of variation. And I talk about that in a lot of different videos. Like I just think that when you're rendering, you can do so much with your various materials that why not take advantage of that basically. So I might get like I think I need a pretty heavy shadow here as well. And then this part that's on the bottom of the forearm, I would probably throw in some rendering lines here. So I'll just throw those in real basic at first just to kind of check it. Heavier line weight at the bottom here, since I left that little bit of light right there. If not, that would just all be a shadow filled in. Sculpt some of this anatomy a little bit. Yeah, I think something like that. And then I would just render maybe some tight, kind of thick to thin lines. Just some little points, really. I think that tends to make something look more specular as well. So that's what you see me do here. Just these tiny little tapered points. Hopefully I'm not blacking it with my hand as I tend to do. And then over here I could go, just to mix it up a little bit, I could do a few tighter in succession and then blend those off. Just so it's not too boring. Because I feel like if I do just these little points everywhere, it looks okay, but then it gets a bit repetitive and therefore boring. Okay, and that's basically how I would do the wrist piece here, so, or forearm piece, I guess. So what happens is that now, hopefully that looks a tiny bit specular, not nearly like the shoulder piece. I don't want it to look chrome. And then once you fill in that blue and the light blue with the highlights, that should come out pretty good. And then as far as the arm, I'm going to, again, I'm going to get in those shapes of shadows. Obviously, I'm going to do all those tiny little hair lines that you do for Wolverine. That gives it some texture, and it's just stippling, really. And you could play around and do that all sorts of ways, but just tiny little dots or lines everywhere. But then when I go to shade this, I'm probably going to use like a lighter cross hatching. So not thick like up here, a similar type of cross hatching, but lighter. And that way it doesn't conflict with the way I did the wrist piece or forearm piece. And again, it gives it stages in the work. It all has its own kind of idea going on there. And in turn, I think it makes it look more interesting. So that's about it. I don't want to make this video too awfully long. Hopefully this has explained a thing or two for you. I would love to know what you think in the comments section below, as well as what you'd like to see in the future. As always, keep drawing, keep having fun, and I will talk to you soon.